it's a single player game. You need to solve a problem for one single person using your product alone. If you solve it for that person, other people will also have that value. And then you can start thinking about what will happen if everybody starts using the product together and how you'll change the world. But if no one person wants to use it, you'll never be able to do it.
Here's the key to my front door. You got a pillow if you lost yours. You got a seat at my table. You got a here's somebody who believes you. Let truth remind you. You've always got a place to go to. You got a home.
Welcome to The Creator's Journey. I'm your host, Charles Gupton. Each week, I'll talk with creative leaders who face the same fears and obstacles we all face. What makes these folks effective are the processes they've developed that allow them to push through the darkness to consistently ship their work and make a difference. If you've ever felt that your fears and insecurities are getting the best of you, know that you're not alone. Every creator who works from the heart faces the same challenges. Come join our community at thecreatorsjourney.com for ideas and inspiration that will bring light and direction to your journey.
Here's the key to my front door. You got a pillow if you lost yours. You got a seat at my table. You got a here's somebody who believes you. Let truth remind you. You've always got a place to go to. You got a home.
I want to welcome Dr. Caneel Joyce to the show today. Caneel is the founder of Kick-Ass Enterprises. Not just any, but the Kick-Ass Enterprises, a boutique consulting firm that helps startups and mission-driven innovators grow in smart, powerful, and sustainable ways. Good morning, Caneel.
Good morning, Charles.
By way of further introduction, I understand that you spent the first half of your life as an actress and artist, but then dove into academics, including being a professor of management at the London School of Economics.
Yeah, isn't that weird? They're connected in some way.
Well, it's a good way to jump in. You also worked in a series of startups before going back to school, earning your PhD in organizational behavior, then completed research that focuses on the psychological and social effects of constraint on creativity. Now, as a consultant, you use creativity, data, and behavior design to help companies make better things. You also help teams understand types of conflict and how to use it to do better work. As we get into a discussion of your dance between your right brain and left brain work, I'd like to hear what brought you to dancing in a bikini, smashing electronics with a baseball bat in a YouTube video. How does that mesh with the bookish, research-driven Caneel?
Oh, good find. Yes, that's one of my most fun projects I've ever done. So I believe that all of my best successes in life have been because I chose to spend a lot of my would-be homework time and studying time partying with my friends. and I just really I'm sort of a hedonist, and I like to be with people that I love, and I like to have a good time. So I've got, I would say, for a professor, ex-professor, I have an unusually cool and awesome group of really, really creative friends who have shown me a good time on many levels. So that video was kind of a co-production between two of my dear friends that come from really different segments of my life. One of them is Hunter Mack, who is also a professor and got his PhD at Berkeley. We met while we were there. He's an engineer, as a lot of my friends are. And he also runs a record label called Gold Robot Records. And they produce only, what are the teeny albums. They don't make CDs. You know, he does have his tracks online, but he really believes in the power of vinyl. And so that Meanest Man contest is a band that he represents. He was doing a video. I connected him with a friend of mine who's a fantastic film director, Greg Tuzin. And Greg has done work, some commercial work. He's done some short films. He used to work at IDEO. He's creative powerhouse. And so he directed that video. So then he asked some friends of mine and I to get together and put on our bikinis and our boomboxes on our heads and smash up some electronics with baseball bats. It was the most fun.
That's the kind of request you get probably every week.
I wish.
How about that?
That would be a good week. Yeah. It's actually really hard to stand in heels and smash televisions with a baseball bat with the boombox because it's really hot inside of the boombox. It was super sweaty in there, and you can't breathe terribly well. You can't really see very well. Your balance is all off. It's a similar experience to what I'm having now of being 8 months pregnant, except it's much cooler.
And I imagine easier when you're not in heels.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of friends and descriptions, what are 3 words that other people would use to describe you?
Creative, open-minded. Then for the people who don't know me as well, I would say sometimes I'm described as too serious.
What an interesting mix. Mm-hmm. Well, after seeing the video, I don't think anyone else would use that description. A lot of creativity experts advise that people should create a sense of total freedom when brainstorming. But you argue for the opposite, that limitations actually help you create new ideas and solve big, tricky problems. How and why is that? Let's just jump into who and what you do.
Right. So that's really like the thrust of my research was tackling that question. I come from a really creative household. My mother is a fine artist, and she raised me like I was just totally surrounded by the arts of all forms, from the moment I was born. And I learned a ton from her. And kind of one of the things I learned was how to structure completely unstructured problems. And one of her favorite techniques for painting, which is one of her many art forms, is you start with a blank canvas, of course, but then you don't think about what you're going to paint. You just cover it with some color. Sometimes she does like a wash of mostly water and a little bit of acrylic. Sometimes she just like smushes a rag covered in paint across it. Sometimes she draws some lines to give you something to work with. And then from there, the picture emerges. And so it's been like a habit of mine to start with something and not judge what that thing is or not think too hard about it, which has really been helpful to me. So when I decided for some reason that I wanted to get a PhD, and the thing I wanted to study was creativity. And I think this was just me kind of really leaving the theater and those dreams sort of, putting them aside for an indeterminate amount of time to indulge like my more scientific side. And my father's a neuroradiologist, so I think I get that from him. But I still wanted to stay really connected to the world of art. And so I wanted to study the creative process. And then I was just shocked at what I was reading didn't resonate at all with me as being true. And I have, a lot of friends who are designers and engineers, and I know that that's the way that the total freedom thesis is not at all the way that they approach their work. So I felt like there was another hypothesis that needed to be tested, which was around constraint and how limitations in freedom actually could be helpful. So I did a bunch of research on that, varying from laboratory studies all the way to studying designers in the field who were working on inventing new products. So really like a big range of experiences. And what I consistently found was that those who set a constraint for themselves early in terms of what kind of problem they're trying to solve are the ones who end up with the most creative solution. It was not those that just kept things open. And it didn't really matter what the problem was. And that's what's I think so very freeing about understanding how to use constraints is it takes a lot of the burden of choice off of the creator.
Well, along those lines, it seems to me a lot of people jump into brainstorming ideas to come up with a lot of ideas and solutions without fully refining what the primary question is that they're asking. I guess another way of saying it may be to define the challenge you're trying to solve before you try to start creating a lot of or possible solutions. You want to talk about that process of refining questions and narrowing that?
Yeah. Yeah. The reason, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think the reason that that's a very important place to spend some of your time early on is when you start throwing ideas out from the hip, it feels really fun, right? It feels really creative and energizing, and people get a little bit manic, and there's this high in the room. And that is, it's a drug, it's an artificial sensation. And we've found in the laboratory that there is no correlation between feeling creative and being creative.
As you say that, it makes me think of people who confuse activity with accomplishment. You're doing a lot of stuff, but
Yes. It's what it is the sensation of activation.
right.
Activation is another word for like energy or arousal. And so at the cellular level, it's very, I mean, and I think it's not, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's fun. We should have as much fun as we freaking can. But it doesn't mean you're solving the problems that you're out to solve. So what tends to happen when you're in that kind of state and you're just generating ideas at random is that the ideas you're coming up with are pretty similar to the ideas that anybody else would come up with, given the same stimuli, the same prompt.
Yeah.
It's a really good way to have a lot of general unoriginal ideas. So creativity being defined and measured as the combination of originality and usefulness, you need to have both pieces. And it's very important in order to find original ideas that you have a way to defend them strategically, that your competitors will not be on the same page as you, is to narrow the space in which you are innovating. So imagine that there's your problem space that you're brainstorming in is a big circle. It's a circular universe. And when you are not constraining the types of ideas you're going to think about, you kind of are in the center, which is status quo. You're right where you are. You're at the status quo. And then you kind of explore in one direction for a little while, and you go in another direction for a little while, and you go behind you, and you go to the side of you and above you. But basically you're staying within a pretty small radius from where you started. A lot of ideas that other people would have thought of if they were given the same amount of time. If you say, we can explore any kind of idea as long as it solves X problem, then you are forced by the function of time to first you get out your kind of expected non-original ideas that are about that problem. And then you go further and further and further and further out into that space until you're in a really original zone. And then you start having some ideas that your competitors wouldn't have thought of unless they were also hell-bent on solving that one particular problem.
Right.
So for me, that visual really helps. And I heard a quote from Carlos Santana. He was talking about his musical process and how he uses improvisation to compose new songs. He said that usually he has to jam for a couple of hours. And about the first 45 minutes to an hour is just kind of boring stuff. It's only after he pushes through that first bit that Carlos Santana starts coming out, and that's where he discovers his new music. And I think there's just something about you have to be pushed far beyond your comfort zone to get really creative, and that's what constraint does for you. That's one of the things constraint does for you.
I would say that being creatively productive when you have no pressure is a cakewalk, but doing it under a deadline or other pressures, you've got to focus. How do you suggest setting appropriate boundaries to allow creative work to flourish, even under those kinds of pressures?
You bring up an interesting paradox, which is that constraints are not as necessary for some people as they are for others. Really, what my read of the literature and the data that I have collected around this issue suggests that the more inexperienced you are in a given domain, the more you need external constraints posed upon you, because you have not already developed your own routine for constraining the space. So